Yesterday we talked about the Federal Elections Campaign Act. Today we'll talk about the Supreme Court case Buckley versus Valeo. The issue here is whether or not the money spent in elections is protected by the First Amendment. And so there were a couple of issues at play in this case. The first two we talked about yesterday: contribution limits to candidates and being required to disclose who you are when you make those contributions. There were three other elements that were challenged. The third one you see there was originally there was a limit to how much a candidate could spend on their own campaign. Okay, think like Bloomberg here. Number four, there were originally limits to how much a campaign could spend total. And then five, the law also stopped outside individuals from making what were called independent expenditures. Outside groups or individuals spending their own money advocating for or against candidates. And so the issue here was, when are these circumstances free speech and when are they not closely enough related to speech, and so therefore restrictions on those actions are legitimate. What I might do is pause at this point, think about, are there any connections you can see for when you think the court will say something is speech and when they will say it is not. The results of the case were as follows. So the first two items, the ones related to the contributions of candidates, those restrictions were upheld by the court. The next three, the ones related to campaign spending, both total and by an individual running for office, and the independent expenditures, the spending advocating for candidates by outside groups, all three of those bans were struck down. So what is it that makes the first two acceptable limits and the next three not okay because they're a violation of your free speech? Again, I might pause right now and see if you can think of any reasons for the results. This is the analogy that I've used in the past. I like to think of the money in elections as a bullhorn. Okay, and so what the courts have said is, when you are speaking a core political message, when you are saying, I'm gonna buy a sign and put it in my front yard that says, I support Donald Trump. When I, as an organization, want to make a commercial saying that somebody should be elected, that's my core political speech. That's the whole thing the First Amendment is intended to protect, me expressing a political viewpoint. And so those restrictions are no good. However, what the courts have said is that when you're simply giving money to somebody else, when you're passing that bullhorn so that they can speak their message more loudly, you're not really saying anything. You're just simply helping someone else amplify their voice. And so that's not as closely associated with political speech, and so those restrictions are good. And if you go back a slide, you can kind of see how that works. The two restrictions that have been upheld are simply involving me helping somebody else speak a message more clearly. With these three, I'm Bloomberg and I want to tell everyone why I'd be a great president. Well, that's me expressing my viewpoints and what I would do and what I believe. That's core political speech. And the same thing goes for my campaign spending overall. I can't be limited in how often I want to tell people what my viewpoints are. And it's equally true of the third one. I want to make signs or commercials on my own saying what I think about issues and people, then I'm free to do so because that's the purpose of the First Amendment. So that's kind of the results of the Buckley versus Valeo case. So what does it mean moving forward? Well, number one, there's a big loophole in FECA, and that's called soft money. Soft money doesn't have any limits to how it's raised, and it doesn't have to be disclosed to the public. And so the biggest loophole is that the parties are able to fundraise as much as they want. So if I'm a really wealthy individual, I am banned from giving a candidate any more than $2,800. But what I can do at this point in time is I could give millions of dollars to the political parties, and then they could funnel that money to the candidates with no limits. So any money spent by parties at this point in time was considered soft money. The biggest loophole, and it kind of comes as a result of the Buckley versus Valeo case, was the soft money used to make commercials. Okay, and particularly what were considered issue ads. So the idea is this: if you're going to advocate for or against a candidate directly, that should be using hard money. However, if you want to talk about issues, abortion, taxes, gun rights. If you want to talk about issues, then you can use unlimited amounts of money and you don't have to disclose who you are, because that's what Buckley versus Valeo told us. That's core political speech, and so it should not be subject to limitations. But what people quickly found out is that as long as they didn't use a couple of special words, vote for, support, defeat, you could talk about candidates as much as you wanted, but as long as you didn't use that specific language, then what you had was an issue ad rather than expressed advocacy. That means you can use soft money instead of hard money. So here's an example of what would have been an expressed advocacy ad. This is telling somebody who to vote for. Oops.
Well, I felt that Ronald Reagan wasn't too good for education in California when he was governor.
I don't think Reagan showed enough compassion for the people of California.
What he did with the mental hospitals is a crime.
He made a lot of statements about cutting back spending. He really never did. It's already common knowledge that he doubled our tax rate. I don't know of anything he did for this thing.
When it comes to a choice, I'll take Jimmy Carter.
I voted for President Carter in the primary. I voted for him 4 years ago, and I'll vote for him again.
On November 4th, re-elect President Carter.
All right, pretty clearly expressed advocacy. It uses those magic words at the end. And here's a really famous one. This is from George H.W. Bush. This is called the Willie Horton ad. And notice you should take a pretty clear message from this. Like it's not ambiguous who you should be voting for at the end. And yet, because it doesn't use those magic words, this would not be subject to hard money requirements. This would be an ad that could be made using soft money, which again means there's no limit to how it was raised or no requirement that those donors be disclosed to the public.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Woo! All right, so this is, again, it's pretty obvious who you're supposed to vote for, and yet this is an issue ad. The issue is crime, doesn't tell you directly who to vote for, and so that's able to use soft money. So that's kind of the big implication of Buckley. Contributions to candidates aren't core political speech, and those are subject to limitations. But independent expenditures, money spent by outsiders trying to shape elections, for the most part, are able to use soft money, which is kind of the opposite of the goal of campaign finance law. We want to know who's trying to bankroll candidates. And so as a result of Buckley, outside groups are a little bit more able to spend anonymously, making commercials that don't directly advocate for candidates, but get pretty darn close.